Stanton, last time we talked, we discussed the idea that progressives have moved from a stance of getting people what they need in harm reduction, and people who still claim that they're harm reductionists, they wave that banner, who are coercing people into treatment. That's the policy idea now. Let's make sure people get into treatment, whether they like it or not, because it's what they need. And we discussed those implications, and what that really means at a fundamental level. Mine is my topic here is like it's partly a follow-up to that, and it's partly tongue-in-cheek because it's based off of a conversation that I had with somebody who follows our work. First, I'm going to make an admission. I watch a program that's run by Dr. Drew. Don't, the reason I do is because it's a comedy show. And in this show, Dr. Drew Pinsky is playing the straight guy. Like he just has to be himself and actually answer medical questions as he believes them to be so. And then there are comedians around him that are using that as fodder for jokes. And so I just think it's the funniest thing. He's kind of like anyway. So I happen to know.
Setting Dr. Drew up, is that sort of what the show is doing? They're
What's that?
fun of
They're not disagreeing with him. They're using him. So it's just they believe that what he's saying must be true because he's the doctor, but then making light of it and turning it into absurdity. So anyway, it's very entertaining, but not for 1 second would I turn to Dr. Drew Pinsky for advice regarding mental health or addiction, because I think that his ideas around those concepts are crazy. So why am I talking about Dr. Drew? Because somebody recently, somebody who follows our work, told me that she's been watching Dr. Drew and reading what he's put out, and she has to say she thinks that he's progressed in his thinking, that he's evolved, and that he's so much harm reduction, such a progressive guy on drugs and addiction that he's just like LPP. And I didn't want to record something just to, it's not like the roast of Dr. Drew, but I see how people think this, and this is sort of based on our last conversation, that people who call themselves progressive or call themselves harm reduction, or say that they have, who say that they want to ameliorate or alleviate stigma associated with people who use drugs or have addiction issues, they have just as draconian ideas about how to involve themselves with drug users. So just for an example, if I'm playing devil's advocate or my friend's advocate, then I would say, yes, I think I've heard Dr. Drew say things recently that he's not said before. For instance, he said he believes that drugs are not inherently bad. Now that's something that contradicts what he used to say when he had a show when celebrities came on and he told them that they're like demon molecules that they're using. Fair enough. That's like an evolution in his thinking. And he said things like he believes that some people can use drugs with, virtual impunity. They're fine. He believes that it's unfortunate that doctors won't prescribe painkillers as often, or they feel thwarted from the CDC. So he has some practical views that we probably would align with. But where is it coming from? In the same breath, he'll say things, and I'll link to a few of these things. One of his latest interviews, somebody asked him, so what is addiction anyway? And he said, well, fundamentally, it all comes from genetics. And so you either have the gene or you don't. And it's not one gene, it's a bunch of genes too. So he's got like the genes in a swirling soup idea that you either have it or you don't. And it's turned on or it's not. So some people can use drugs, but you never know which one that is. He has another idea that there's traumatic experiences are causing it. And not only does trauma turn on this flare of genetics or whatever the hell he believes about why addiction happens, he thinks that you really have to go revisit that trauma. Something doesn't just ever happen to a person that says, I lived through it, I think I'm good, I'm better for it. You really have to go revisit your trauma and figure out what's going on. And lastly, he is one of the latest examples of people who, I know you mentioned that Newsom is talking about this. Dr. Drew believes that the way out of this homelessness epidemic that seems to be occurring, or just a rise in homelessness, if you want to be practical, is to coerce people into treatment. I mean, that's his idea. So drugs aren't bad. Um, addiction is at a basic level, just you got to deal with it practically. But you can't say that and in the same breath say we should coerce people into treatment. So I guess I'm just using this as an example, a singular example of a person who maybe through some statements could seem like a very practical guy, but he's
Well, Dr. Drew is really, in a way, a model progressive. He's sort of saying, we're not down on people who are addicted. It's that they're genetically predisposed or they had trauma. That's the modern disease theory that sort of everybody agrees with.
right.
And what's left out of that is, what Liz Evans was trying to do. Well, so you've got two camps, that's AA. You've got two camps of people who can use and people who can't use. How does that relate to Vietnam? We had a bunch of people addicted, and then you brought them home and got them positively engaged in communities and life, and they stopped being addicted. How does that deal with your situation? Right. Were you one of those genetically traumatized people who was an addict? Though all of those neurobiological, and trauma is essentially, as seen by Gabor Mate, a neurological, biological model, are all essentially disease repressive models that deny the human capacity for growth, which is the only alternative to the drug war. And the disease theory, Dr. Drew's version of it being just highlighting the example of all of them, makes it impossible to ever change our approach to drugs. And it, as you point out, it belies, we're not going to stigmatize drugs or drug users. We're going to stigmatize drug users' genes and lives because they're inherently addicted and they were traumatized. That's not their fault, but their lives are doomed. They have to say, I'm an addict forever, which of course, how is that any kind of advantage? And how is that not stigmatizing? So we have a modern, at one point, it seemed as though we were going to get away from the disease theory. People claim they're getting away from stigma. People claim they're getting away from the drug war, but we're all just shaking the box up to maintain our basic underlying assumptions, which is that addiction is an underlying, fundamentally neurobiological disease that can't be changed about a person.
Now I've got two case studies here. Dr. Drew was faced with the question in an interview I was watching. Does anybody ever argue with your model? What would be the best argument? And so he went to evolutionary biology because I feel like the more abstract you can get, the more you can seem like, you can use argument from authority and you know better. So he said, well, people might say, well, if it's genetic, how come those genes have survived? Why wouldn't the addiction so horrible? Then why are those genes still around? And he said, and I would respond to those people by saying, well, on the flip side of the genes that might make you addicted, they must serve some purpose. And so there are a lot of people who are, risk takers and great athletes, and maybe they can fly a plane or blah 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 blah. What he's trying to say is there's a model for turning whatever has made somebody addictive on its head and leaning on those strengths. So he almost, in a way, he's almost arguing with himself and saying the same thing that's genetic that makes you addicted is maybe the same thing that makes you successful in another light. He can't connect those dots because he's operating through story. There's a story that has been told and he preserves that story. On the other hand, I was talking to a man yesterday. His name's Chris Chabris. He wrote a book called The Invisible Gorilla. Do you know that experiment or those studies?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but studies about inattention or inattentiveness. And so, just to explain really quickly, he's a cognitive scientist or psychologist, and he did this major study that he won some prize for that he turned into a YouTube video. Two teams, one black team of 3 people, one team wearing white shirts of 3 people. They're all passing balls around, and it asks you at the beginning of the video, Your job as the viewer is to count how many passes are thrown and caught by the white team. All right, go. So it's playing for 30 seconds and you count it. And at the end of the video, it asks, okay, what'd you get? And then it shows you the correct answer was 15. And some people get it right. Usually people get right around the right answer. But you have to focus to count them. And at the end, it says, but did you see the gorilla? And so there's actually, if you rewind the video, there's while people are passing the ball, there's a person in a gorilla suit who walks right in front of the screen, bangs his chest, and slowly walks away, that most people don't actually see because they're too busy counting the passes. Okay. This is the kind of thinking that this person does. And I just happened to mention addiction to him, drugs and stuff like that to him. And it seems like it's really the first time he gave it much thought. But he's a logical guy who just wrote a book called Nobody's Fool about how to avoid traps in thinking. You know, you go off a habitual repertoire when you notice things or believe things. So he just did some basic stuff. He said, well, let's back this up. Like I know in psychiatry, for example, people think that antidepressants work for depression. And I guess that's based on a model that, that ostensibly there's a drug that does something to a neurotransmitter. Then again, I don't know that that's even true that it does. And if it did, does that just doing something to a neurotransmitter take care of all the complex problems that a person might be facing if they have depression? And I imagine that would be similar to addiction, like maybe a drug is targeting some area of a brain, but does that really answer all the complex problems that a person might be having in life? Dude, this guy thought about it for 5 minutes, and because he's logical, broke through. He didn't know he was supposed to believe that people are diseased. And so I'm holding those two examples up to each other to show that how powerful our stories are.
It's, in a way, what we're maintaining is so old-fashioned. And so, I mean, people accuse us and the Life Process Program of just being commonsensical. They say, well, you're going to have to deal better with your life at one point or another in order for your life to improve. And it's remarkable. When somebody calls me up and says they want to interview me and they agree with my point of view, I used to be full of, I said, oh, great. And it usually isn't 2 or 3 or 4 minutes into the conversation where they say, oh, will you do something like rapid eye movement therapy? And, that cures the addiction and it reprograms the brain. And so they feel they agree with me because they're saying, well, addiction is not permanent. And so I have a new introduction. Here's my new introduction when I talk to somebody like that. I say, let's pretend we're talking to your grandmother. And we're just going to use common sense terms. And everything that we say has to make sense to your grandmother. And I say, I'm basing that on the fact that really you and I agree they have to improve their lives, which is something your grandmother would say. So almost immediately they'll drop into some kind of special brain therapy. And I say, does your grandmother, I mean, God bless her, she might be dead now. Does she know about that?
That's really
brilliant.
Well,
no. And I said, well, we're only talking to your grandmother. Remember that? You agreed with me that we're only going to talk to your grandmother. So you can't use OCD. You can't use rapid eye movement therapy. You can't use a ton of things. You just have to talk in plain human common sense that your grandmother would understand, because you and I agreed to that. And we agreed that everything that we're talking about is fundamental and has always existed. It's not tied into all this new bullshit. So
let me bring it back around. The same way that you talk about
for bringing it back around to get the people that agree with me to actually talk in a way that makes sense to me.
I think that's amazing, and that's not patronizing, right? You're saying like let's keep it this simple. And so if someone doesn't, you say, remember, we're keeping it this simple. I do the same thing, but I think about talking to like a kindergarten student, or even better, my daughter, Hadley. Sam, she's an amazing mother, and I have been some redeeming qualities as a dad with working with her. And one of them is my ability to explain things to her. I've had so much practice in our life process program and working with kids in schools, explaining things at the most common sense level, that my 4-year-old understands what I'm saying when we talk about seemingly existential things. So my job as a parent to my 4.5-year-old now is to keep her moving, keep her learning, living life, and not going down like magical solution kinds of doors or the wrong path, but to stay on the straight and narrow and do things that make sense once you evaluate them. That's what the life process program is. We don't have a magical cure. We don't have a quicker solution than improving your life. And that's also why we are different. That's what makes this distinguishes us and act and true harm reduction from people who claim they are and who say, let's do this magical thing or this is the magical cause.
I almost imagine you, this isn't exactly how you work, but I often imagine you being in a group of people dealing with a student, and then people go, they go to the brain scans and, neurological theories. And I almost imagine you saying something, you I have a learning disability. I'm kind of dumb. So would you mind terribly, like, just talking about straight human behavior and things that I can understand? I'd appreciate it so much if you could just do that. And
I
you would never be so
should do that.
obvious or play a game like that. But that's sort of what you're doing. You're kind of going, forget that other stuff. It just goes over my head. Pretend
Right.
I'm just some dumb parent or kid. They're not dumb, obviously, but
Right,
just
right.
talk in a way that it can make sense to dumb old me.
That's a great way to do it. Maybe that's our new trend is that we're not allowed to say anything or explain anything without being able to also explain it to a 4-year-old or somebody's grandmother.
That's why I know you met my old friend, Old Ann. Old Ann she's dead. She was born in 1928.
Mhm.
Before everybody knew about OCD and the disease theory. So she never ever used any of that. I like old people because they never learned all of this new layer of bullshit. They just
Right.
talk like a normal, sensible old human being. And let's just keep one thing in mind. Why are we panicking now around drugs? Because 110,000 people a year are dying from drug use when originally they proposed the addiction is a brain disease. When that was originally proposed in 1993, 7,000 people a year were dying. So, we're jumping 100,000 people every decade and a half. You like to think if you come up with a great new idea that things would improve. They're not improving. Right. And we're psychotically attached to the thing that's supposedly improving the thing that's actually getting worse. It's almost like we have to turn back the hands of time. So I'd like to see how, Dr. Drew's not going to interview you or me. By the way, Dr. Drew did interview a good friend of ours. They had a controlled drinking thing. Our friend out in California. And when they were interviewed, he did that whole routine that you said. Well, some people can drink and not become addicted. That's just like, and it might be a Jewish characteristic. The two people who spoke, they both had drinking problems, and they were Jewish. And it's just a way of just bringing back the disease theory in a new, slightly more plausible form.
So thanks for indulging me by doing our comparison. So I couldn't help. It was almost a snide intro to that. But in a way, we're kind of saying here's a blueprint for being able to discern people who are authentically worried about human beings and thinking logically versus people who are making some of the noises that person would make, except they're still rooted in some fundamentally flawed theory about what humans are.
Our work is cut out for us. Me and Dr. Drew are going to be dead at some point, so you're going to have to carry on your own, but you're doing a great job.
All right, Stanton. Thank you so much.